Look at this. It's a Gruen. Dietrich Gruen was a German-American watchmaker and spelt his name in the traditional German way, G-R-U umlaut N. But of course that doesn't translate to English, so hence the insert of the E. So now Gruen. And the watch company was formed in 1874. It's a long history, and they have beautiful designs, and I've always been impressed with their creations. Lovely, isn't it? The Veri-Thin, Gruen Veri-Thin. Well, let's get the back opened. Let's see what we have. It's a pretty movement. 17 jewels. We'll just open the front bezel here to get to the hands. These are gold plated. I see a little bit of tarnish on them, but the numerals look nice. Now the watch is not working, but at least it's moving the hands. So we'll get these set up to midday and pop these off. I don't know what's wrong with it. It feels like when I wind the movement, it doesn't seem to have any tension. So I'm wondering if it's mainspring related. We'll just turn it over to get to the case screws on the other side. There's a couple here. They're nicely polished. That's one of the things about these Gruens, is they do some wonderful work just finishing the movement. There's an amazing 50th anniversary Gruen, 1924. Which is incredible. All of the gears and components are all polished. Quite rare to find them though. Now to get this movement out, I need to undo this crown release screw just here, and then I can pull the crown free. Once that's out of the way, we should just be able to drop the movement forward out of the case. There we go. Just get this little loose hair out of the way before we continue. There's a couple of dial screws. One thing I noticed about this dial, which is quite unique, is the convex shape. It's quite pronounced. It gives it an interesting appeal. And the other thing here is this little sub-dial is completely separate for the seconds hand. I'll need my cannon pinion remover to pull this cannon pinion out. Very effective tool. Ancient, vintage, probably 100 years old, but it works. The cannon pinion really holds the two sides of the watch together, so before we can release anything on the other side of the movement, it does need to be removed. I'm using Rodico, which is a putty, a watch putty, here to remove some of these components. Very useful for cleaning up and removing hairs and oils and parts. We're getting quite close now on this side. convex shape of the dial is also in the base plate here. Do you see that? It does make me wonder when this watch was manufactured. Unfortunately with Gruen, it's one of the challenges that just typing in a serial number here won't reveal any information about the manufacturing date. But there are clues here, and with our Sherlock Holmes hat on we can start to work things out. There's no ink block spring protection, so it's probably pre-1950s. And if we look at the balance wheel here, this Corona Ruma is Gruen's term for Elinvar, and Elinvar watches came out in the 1930s. So I'm going to say between 35 and 50 for the watch, somewhere in that period. We really have to look elsewhere though, and Wadsworth made cases for Gruen. And we can see here this is a G serial case. G were 1940s to 49, and the G8 is a 1947 case. So with that, I'm placing this watch as a 1947 Gruen. Let's continue onwards and remove the balance. Just one screw holding this in. If there were two, it'd be a bridge, and since it's only one, it's a balance cock. So you need to be very careful of that spring. Those alloy metals, while very clever in their time for temperature and magnetic behaviors, they were very soft. Just checking that our pallet fork has no power on it. There's nothing on the mainspring, and I don't think there is. It's just sitting there in the center of the bridge, two screws. This is the pallet fork bridge. Again, nicely polished. Everything's very sticky on this watch though. I'll just lever this up carefully. I don't want to damage anything. Oh, there we go. And you can see the whole pallet fork came away with it. And that turned out to be stuck in the jewel. It tells me those oils are really old, but the pallet fork looks in good shape. It survived. This is the escape wheel cock. Liking the polished end to where the jewel sits. Very fancy. I think the escape wheel should come out. Yes, I can't remove the other wheels. They make up the train of wheels, but until I remove this bridge, we can't get to those gears. And I leave a little spot underneath here and at the corner, so I can put my screwdriver in and just pry that up. Again, all the gears are sticking into the jewels. But they survived. And perhaps I can't get that center gear out just yet. I'll need to remove this last bridge. So we'll work on the ratchet wheel. This is sitting over the mainspring. And the clicker here, which we have to be a little bit careful of since there's a small spring underneath. Yeah, they came out together. Now we can get the center wheel out as well. And that will be the last of the train of wheels. This crown wheel is an interesting design. Many watch companies have used reverse thread screws in the center here to stop the crown unwinding while you wind the watch up. And so this is a novel idea of just using 2 screws. That makes a lot of sense. To get to our mainspring barrel, we'll need to remove this bridge, and I'm noticing all of this old grease down by the side here. And so far we still haven't found the main cause of our issue, the root cause of why the watch is not working, but my suspicion is that it is related to this mainspring. When I was trying to wind the watch using the crown, I just wasn't getting any pressure at all. And we could also see with the pallet fork that there was no tension on that. So this is definitely suspect number 1. And we'll just get the bridge removed. And we can get access to the mainspring barrel here. I'll just take it out for now, and we'll open that up and have a look, see what we can find. Because there are a few more small items here I just want to remove to finish up this main plate. I want to make sure that when we remove this, because there's 2 sides to it, that we put that back together before the main plate goes back in. This was used to free up access for us to pull the crown stem out. And I'm thinking this is probably the last piece we need to remove, and then we can get on with a good inspection of this main plate. And we'll do that under magnification. I'll bring in the microscope, and while I'm able to look through the eyepieces and get a good stereo definition of what's going on, you can follow along with that high definition 34 megapixel camera, which is connected into our computer, so you're seeing what I'm seeing. And look at this grease. I'm just using a little bit of pegwood here to try and remove the bulk of it before we put the base plate into the ultrasonic cleaner. So if I can get as much of this off as possible, that'd be a good start. The jewels are looking quite nice. I don't see any damage to them, which is good news. But we will clear out some of these holes. Again, I'll use my pegwood for that. And while we have the microscope in place, it's a good chance for us to inspect these wheels. In particular, I'm looking at the pinions, and there's a little wear on them. Certainly they're dirty, but no major damage that I can see. And they might need a burnish, but we'll see what they look like after cleaning. I'm going to start by getting the bulk off by using this pithwood. Pithwood is a fine grain wood, and we can insert the stems directly into it. It's quite soft, and this just helps us clean and polish those pivots up. We'll do this for all of the wheels. And then I'm going to pop them into this basket here, and we'll drop them into the ultrasonic cleaner for a good clean and rinse. So let's open up this mainspring barrel and see what we can find. Yes, straight away look at that. The mainspring is completely broken. into, well, everything looks clean otherwise, but we'll need to order ourselves a new mainspring. That clearly was the culprit, and why we couldn't get a wind on the watch and why it isn't working. It should be a relatively easy fix. This is a good opportunity just to check where we were at with the movement. Everything's out of the cleaner, but I do have to declare we had an accident. Yes, I was trying to lift this tiny screw out of the basket and drop it into the cleaning tray, but when I did so, I actually dropped the screw. But worse than that, see, they have a habit of jumping away. I caught my tweezers. Tweezers on the cleaning tray. It tipped over, and the parts I was cleaning flew everywhere. I did manage to find everything except the click spring here. So I don't have a click spring. I spent about an hour looking for it. Couldn't find it. Gave up. So we'll need to find a new one. The only other thing of note here on the base plate, these are cap screws, and they have these tiny little screws again that hold these in place, these cap plates, and these were loose. When I put the complete base plate into the cleaning machine, it worked. I guess the ultrasonics worked those screws completely loose, so they came out. I was very fortunate to find them before we threw out the dishwater. These came out nice, a train of wheels. I'll check them one more time under the microscope before we do our rebuild, to make sure they're good. The obvious, of course, is this mainspring. And we'll need to order a new one of those. That was broken, as we know. But everything cleaned up with the barrel and the arbor. It's all in good condition. I did not pull apart the balance yet. I will have a look under the microscope before deciding how far to go with this, because it's a very delicate part and we don't want to disturb it too much if it's unnecessary. Love the convex base plate. That really is looking very spiffy. Dial's good. I cleaned up the case a little bit, so it's all ready. We have a decision to make. I can find a new mainspring. Those are available. We can order one. But finding one of these, a click spring, is proving very difficult. I did come across a donor movement, and the donor movement will have all of these parts, and it makes more sense for me to invest in that, and that way I have something that, should any of these be a failure point now or in the future, we can replace it and use that donor movement. And it was of good value, so rather than just wait and see if we can hopefully come across a click spring in the future, I think we'll get that donor movement in and use that to help us rebuild the watch. So that's the plan. Back soon. The balance wheel does look very good under magnification, and I haven't cleaned it yet. There's just one small concern I have, and I'll zoom in a little bit closer on this hairspring for you. And just pull back the balance wheel, and you'll see just to the left of the regulator pins, you see that little nick? That's a little bit worrying, and I'm inclined to try this back in the movement once we have the new mainspring, but the donor movement may have to rescue us on this as well. The wheels came out really nice. Look at those pivots now after cleaning and using the pith wood to polish those up. I'm happy with those. These jewels look fabulous in the base plate. Those score marks are sometimes caused by those pivots on the wheels when the watch is put back together, but I don't see any damage to the jewels. Our donor movement has just arrived. Let's check it out. Actually looks pretty complete. Very nice condition for a donor movement. The dial and the hands, crown. So we need a couple of parts from this. One is that click spring right under here. It's a mystery where that went. But let's hope that's in place. Yes, I can see it. So that's part number one. And then the other item I was interested in off the donor movement is the mainspring. I could have purchased a new mainspring, but since we have the donor movement, I think it's worth just checking to see what condition this one is in and if we can reuse it. Pocket watches were getting towards the end of the era of their popularity in the late 40s, and companies like Gruen really had to adapt to the up-and-coming wristwatch market, which they did very successfully. They held an appeal with the rich and famous of the time. Ian Fleming wrote in the James Bond novels that 007 always wore a Rolex watch. But in that first movie, Dr. No, Sean Connery actually had pulled a Gruen 510 from his personal collection, and that's what you see popping out from under his tuxedo arm in that opening casino scene. And that Gruen watch was to appear on 4 different James Bond movies of that era, along with a Rolex, of course. Every good spy still needs a radium dial in order to test their Geiger counter. We have the mainspring barrel out of our donor movement, ready for inspection. And this time I don't see any broken spring, just a few little crumbs that need cleaning up, but I think we can make use of that. That's fortunate. We'll get this barrel closed up. And we'll put that away. Our first task to rebuilding this base plate is to put a tiny drop of train oil on these jewels. These are our cap plates, and I'm trying not to touch the jewel when I do this and to get the jewel about half full of oil. We put this back on to the base plate. Oh, I just realized I did that wrong. That's supposed to be a full hole there. I put the wrong cap plate in this area, and I need to remove this screw. But look, one mistake after another. That screw went flying, never to be found. I tried, and so it's back to the donor movement to find a replacement screw. These are some of the smallest screws in this movement. So let's get the right cap jewel in the right place and do our best not to lose these screws. Here's my replacement. These are just 1/2 millimeter in diameter. Super, super tiny. This spring bar here provides tension for the yoke that's controlling the placement of that crown arbor. So when it's, oh, these screws seem to just want to run away today. So when it's released, we can take the crown out. Okay, that's got it. Now just turning the watch over onto the other side, I can get this yoke back in place, and we'll put a little grease here. And I do need to just secure that with some Rodico, because this is held in from the other side. This part always makes me a little bit nervous because we're putting quite a strong spring in place here, but until we get the cap plate secured down, we all know that spring is working on some kind of escape plan. I need to get these gears in place. So I'm working fairly quickly and carefully. And these are our setting gears. One more. Okay, we can get our cap plate in place, and as soon as this is secured, then I'm going to be feeling a bit more comfortable that we have that spring captured. Okay. We'll get some more of this heavy grease in here, and this is for our clutch wheel. For our mainspring barrel, I'm going to be using this medium oil, which is a Mobius D5 or HP 1300. This should be under continuous rotation when the watch is operating. Just get the barrel bridge secured. And put a little bit more D5 on the top here. Oh, that might be a bit too much, so we'll clean up. I can start rebuilding with the crown wheel. I'll use the heavy grease for this part. I need to sit the ratchet wheel just on top of the mainspring barrel. It's not quite sitting right there, but let's get this screw in place and see if we can just make an adjustment to get that sitting correctly. It's working okay. And our lost spring, click spring. This is the replacement from the donor movement. I'm still not happy with that ratchet wheel. Do you see the way it's just sitting up a little bit too high? It does work, but I'm just not comfortable with it, so let's take that out. I don't think it's engaged correctly with the mainspring barrel, so we'll just move it around a little bit and see if we can get that engaged better. I think it's the way the gears are aligned. There we are. That's much better. It's sitting down nicely. So we can get that all secured and move on to our train of wheels. We'll just put the center wheel in first. Oh, wait a minute. That center wheel needs to go underneath the ratchet wheel. I'm not going to be able to get that in place, so let's undo everything again. Just the ratchet wheel. And then I can put that center wheel in place and put it back together. Not terrible. So that's the first wheel of our train, and we can get the rest in place. Third wheel, fourth wheel with our seconds hand on the other side. And the escape wheel. Now, this can be a bit tricky to put the bridge plate on. I've got to line up 3 of those 4 pivots into the jewels, and you can see already that it's sitting a little bit high on the right side, and I can actually see that it's our center wheel that's slightly off, and so the bridge is sitting on top of the pivot, and that's what we need to be really careful of. I will secure it, but I'm certainly not going to tighten this down until everything is lined up. A little tweak on that center wheel and everything is looking good. Running smoothly. I'll just put the escape wheel back in. That takes a different plate, and it's this cock here. And before we put that back into the watch, I need to separate this jewel. There's 2 parts to it, and on the underside here we have a jewel that has a hole in it, and that's for the pivot to go through for the escape wheel, and then there's a solid jewel, a cap jewel on top, and that all needs to be cleaned and oiled so that the pivot sits in the oil. It's a little bit of a tricky procedure, but we'll get these cleaned up first and then we'll oil them. I'll use this 1-dip solution for cleaning. It's quite a strong solvent, so it doesn't need very much. It dries very quickly as well. And the oil will need to sit on this jewel. And again, it's a train oil. We'll put a tiny little drop. This is called Mobius 9010. So the lightest oil. Just make sure I have enough there. And we can put these two jewels back together. I built myself a little platform out of Rodico so I can get this screw back in place. Again, it's one of those tiny screws. I'm definitely having trouble with this screw. I tried a few times to put this plate back here and get these secured, and of course I always risk moving that oil around and that top jewel underneath each time I attempt to do this. Let's try one more time here. It just doesn't want to seat for some reason. I know what the problem is. Did you work it out? Well, after clean up and fresh oil, the screw goes in on the other side of the plate, of course. Now we've straightened that out, I can finish up on this escape wheel cock and we can get it back into the movement. This is the last piece for the train of wheels. I just need to make sure that that pivot goes through the whole jewel before we tighten this down. And then I will want to check and make sure that we have power transfer all the way from the mainspring through each of those gears down to the escape wheel. And everything seems good. Now we can put our pallet fork back. And this is held in place by a bridge. And this will lock the escape wheel, and we can put some wind onto the spring. For the first time in a long time, this is our replacement mainspring. And I just want to check that we can do that successfully. And we'll also check the pallet fork and just make sure we get that nice click backwards and forwards. Yeah, and that's confirming we have good power. We'll just put a little jewel grease onto the pallet fork. And I'll just rotate that around on the escape wheel and clean up any remaining grease from that pallet fork. So now I just need to get this jewel out. We have the same situation, there's a whole jewel underneath. And we'll want to clean those two jewels up and get some oil on that top jewel. To do this I need to remove the hairspring stud and drop our balance wheel out. Again, these are super tiny screws. I need to be careful. And this is our cap jewel here. We'll get this cleaned up in the 1-dip solution. And this is the regulator arm. Oh, dropped it. Now let's try to remember here that these screws are from the bottom side. The more modern movements have a shock jewel system on top, and it's a much easier process to oil those. But these have to be dismantled if we're going to do it properly. Now I just need to get that stud back into the hole there, and then I can tighten up the balance wheel. Because I didn't take the hairspring off the balance wheel, in theory I shouldn't need to make an adjustment for the beat error. The swing should be the same clockwise and anti-clockwise. And now, for the moment of truth. Will she come alive again? We're just going to carefully drop the balance into the movement, and will she start? Oh, almost. Maybe a little help. Oh, look at that. That's fantastic. Definitely one of the best parts of watch repair and watchmaking is to see these mechanical marvels come back to life after who knows how long. And it really is ticking away very nicely. We just will check over the movement. This is the hairspring beating nicely between the regulator pins. And I'm just checking the jewel on the pallet fork engages the escape wheel. We have a scale here on my microscope of 100 equaling 1 millimeter, and we have about 12 hundredths there, and it's even on both sides, which is what we're looking for. It's time to oil up these jewels and pivots. Some of these we already did. That's one of the cap jewels right there. This is the second hand pivot, and oh, the oil is caught on the second hand and isn't going anywhere. I think we need to help it down into the jewel. There it is. These are just tiny drops. That's all that's needed. And for our center wheel, we still have the cannon pinion to go back onto this pivot. We've yet to make our adjustments, but just look at this performance. Amazing amplitude and a beat error, 1 millisecond. Really, that is excellent. But let's get this demagnetized first before we make our final adjustments and see if we can get this dialed in nicely. And what a performance. Look at this. A rate of 1 second per day and amplitude approaching 350. Wonderful. After inspecting these watch hands, I did notice we had quite a bit of pitting on the gold plating. I tried to just clean them up, very light polish, but unfortunately this just resulted in removal of the plating from the watch hands, so I had no choice but to take the plating off. And that's what we're doing here, looking at the difference between the minute hand and hour hand. It's time for a science experiment. Yes, we're going to try gold plating these hands. What can go wrong with some potassium cyanide, a DC power supply, and some stainless steel anodes? Let's set up our experiment. The watch hands have just been through the ultrasonic cleaner, and now we're heating up a hot plate. So the product we have here is an electrochemical cleaner, and it needs 120 Fahrenheit or about 50 Celsius. So we're just there. And my power supply on the right is set for 5 volts. I've got the hands ready to go into the liquid. And we've got a magnetic spinner here that's spinning at 200 revolutions per minute. I'm going to switch that off because there's too much disturbance on the hands. I should just give them a quick clean, and I'm going to just dunk them in this distilled water and then let them dry for a second. Now we're working on the 18 karat gold solution, which requires a slightly lower temperature. So we're down to 46 Celsius. And I've got my hands ready to just dangle in. I'm going to just lift the filament. This is a copper filament that they're dangling from. I just want to make sure that that's in the center of the liquid, and we're at 4 volts now. And we'll apply that just for about 30 seconds, and now you can see we'll dunk them in another beaker of distilled water. We have 18 karat gold plated hands. How about that? A bit difficult to see here, so let's just inspect them under the microscope. Oh, I'm so pleased. They came out wonderfully. They're going to work great in the watch. I'm going to use the remainder of our distilled water and a denture tab to help us clean up this dial. Honestly, it's in pretty good condition already, but this will just help us get rid of any old oils and grime. We'll let that soak for a few minutes. And rinse it out. Some of this I can't move off of the dial. It's over 70 years old, and you're going to get some deterioration. I mean, patina. It's good otherwise. Yeah, we'll get this dried off and we'll put it back into the watch. Just need to put back the cannon pinion first, and that power wheel. And I mustn't forget this seconds dial that goes underneath. There's just 2 screws to hold the dial in place. Now we can get those wonderful 18 karat gold plated hands back on the watch. Don't they look fantastic? Start with the hour hand here. And the minute hand. And last but not least, a little tricky to maneuver this one with my soft tweezers, so I'll use these fine ones, and I'll be extra careful with the dial. Okay, it's ready to be recased. I'd cleaned up the case earlier. I'm just going to put back this front bezel and crystal temporarily because we need to turn it over and put the dial screws in place. and then I'll get everything set correctly. The front bezel and the back of this watch only fit into one orientation in this particular design. They have a slight groove in them, and you can just see that where the crown goes into the movement, and so they just fit over that. Get these lovely polished dial screws tightened up. And while we're here, why don't we put a little bit of wind onto the watch? Very nice. Let's start it up straight away. We just need to fit the case back. And with that, we're coming to the end of our journey. I very much enjoyed working on this Gruen Veri-Thin Pocket Watch from 1947. I'm sure it's had a lot of history. And here it is working again with these wonderful 18-karat gold-plated hands. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoyed the journey with me. And I'll just leave you to enjoy the watch. Until next time.